Okay, this is the first video for the hematologic system. Basically, we're dealing with the blood tissue. I think you'll find that this chapter or topic is pretty simple. There's a lot that can go wrong, but a lot of the principles reoccur. And basically, you're playing with anything that's going to affect the shape, the content, and the size of blood or blood cells. So obviously, it can go towards the two main general types of cells in the blood, meaning white blood cells and red blood cells. We'll start with the red blood cells. Everything when anything that you're going to change in regards to the size, the shape, the amount, and the content of the cells is going to change the characteristics of the tissue. And once again, blood is tissue by definition. And it's going to change the function in the sense that mechanically it's going to change how blood flows, how fast or slow it flows, then its ability to filtrate into other tissues. And then, of course, uh, any processes that are dependent on the chemical content of the cells are going to change. So I think that if you kind of take a step back and you look at the chapter from above, so to speak, you'll see that it's very, very simple. And of course, when we're talking about red blood cells, the first thing that has to come to mind is that they include uh, um, hemoglobin that carries oxygen or CO, and is going to immediately affect metabolism, ischemia, hypoxia, and so on and so forth. So that's very simple to understand. And although there's a lot of conditions and a lot of slides, if you look at them, they're relatively simple to remember and understand. And then also, you'll notice that the first few slides also talk about suffixes and prefixes that give you a clear indication of what's happening. So there's a language here that if you just practice it and you get it, you memorize it, you're gonna understand what's going on pretty fast. So I'm jumping straight to slide 30, believe it or not, and we're going. The first slides talk about a bit about the system and blood vessels. I think that's an easy read, and that's also a brush up. So we're going to go straight to the pathologies. So I'm starting, as I said, from slide 30, which is the title slide for anemias, and then you'll see that the first bullet usually is the definition. Home on to that and remember the definitions. Okay, so an anemia is by definition is a reduction, any reduction in the number of circulating red blood cells or their quality. So we have amount, quality, uh, and quantity of the red blood cells or the hemoglobin within them. Okay, so either or the combination of them. So you see that causes can include alterations to red blood cells production, meaning you're producing too much or not enough. In this case, an anemia is not enough. Any loss of blood, so it's something relative to what you're supposed to have, uh, or an increase in red blood cell destruction, meaning that you had the right amount, but something is killing the cells, is destroying the cells. So you see that the anemias are classified according to cause, uh, the effect, the size, shape, or content. I think that's pretty simple to remember. So we have anisocytosis refers to the assuming of various sizes of cells. Remember that size influences immediately three major aspects. It depends on how picky you want to be. One, a bigger cell moves slower. Two, it's harder for the cell to diffuse. And three, it changes the amount of content you can have inside. Then you can see that poikilocytosis refers to the assuming of various shapes. The shape, once more, can change the dynamics of how it's moved or moves, flows. It can cause greater drag, which will slow down the cell in this case. It might injure the environment if it has spikes or anything like it. It can eliminate the possibility to filtrate. And if it has a different shape, it might influence its content as well. Okay, not necessarily, but possibly. Um, so as you can see, that anemias usually reduce the oxygen carriage capacity that leads to hypoxia. Number one outcome, and you'll see it occur again and again and again and again. Hypoxia, 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 all the time. Of course, you have a pathology. The outcomes, the net outcome, depend on your ability or lack of to compensate and counteract the reasons of the anemia. What else? Then we also know that because we're talking about the blood as a tissue, any reduction in the amount of red blood cells is going to change the volume of the tissue, um, which is counteracted by the entrance of interstitial fluid into the plasma. So you have a gradient in this case that is causing interstitial fluid to enter plasma rather than exit. Obviously, volume might be restored, but remember that the content now is not the same. So viscosity is not the same, and viscosity um, is going to influence first and foremost the tendency to flow slow or fast. In this case, it causes blood to flow faster, and it also causes turbulences. Um, so it causes an increase in cardiac output. Of course, if this continues, you have the circulation that is an abnormal situation. How long is it going to take until it affects the heart, sorry, and the heart's valves and function? So obviously, this is not a good situation to be in. It's a pathology. Um, then, when peripheral blood flow is increased, cardiac output is increased as well. And to cope with the situation, this might lead to hypertrophy and heart failure if it's uncontrolled. Okay. Um, Obviously, with increase of workload, because you have increased blood flow, you have hypertrophy. In this case, you have enlargement of the heart, which is signifies a negative process rather than a positive one. And we saw that before, that left ventricle hypertrophy is not always a good sign, right? Although it happens with exercise. And then one of the visual symptoms that you can see is dyspnea. What else? In severe cases, you can see that a person could be symptomatic at rest. With some people, it will appear only upon exertion, and of course, the more severe the increase in blood flow, the more severe the symptoms are going to be. Obviously, we're dealing with blood. Blood influences the color of skin. It influences almost every, if not every, tissue in the body. So you can expect changes uh, uh, to the function of multiple organs and tissues because of the change to the content of blood. So you see here, mucous membranes, lips, nail beds, and conjunctiva, the eye area become pale or yellowish due to hemolysis, meaning that blood or oxygen, to be more accurate, usually causes blood to be darker. That's why veins appear to be bluish. And in this case, when you have reduced supply of oxygen, everything that is affected by oxygen by color, by means of color, is going to be affected. So at least that's good on one hand, because if you have a pathology, it's better to have visual signs than it to be silent and non-detectable. Obviously, less oxygen means lesser healing. Um, and you can see just one after the other from slide to side how the lack of oxygen just induces a gradient of and a cascade of responses, tissue by tissue, system by system, the more severe it gets. So I think that, if you look up the slide 40, basically, it's it's just showing you how the system is maybe not collapsing, but going further and further into dysfunction until, of course, it will collapse if it's not treated. You have a change to the concentrations of ions and salts, which is going to affect the neural system. It can lead to changes in gradients, leading to hemorrhage and edema. Uh, it might trigger the immune system, so you're going to have inflammation, and so on and so forth. Um, the worse it gets, the more systems starting to be affected, the more symptoms. Obviously, it's becoming an emergency, and you need to take care of it. Okay, talking about microcytic normochromic uh, anemias. Notice that by definition, hemoglobin here is normal. So we're talking about unusually large marrow stem cells, okay, maturing into unusually large red blood cells. Uh, Everything in the cell is enlarged and for the worse. So the thickness of the cell and the volume are bigger. Thickness means that the membrane is thicker. That means that the in and out uh, uh, um, flow or motion of substances is harder, and that means that the membrane is less functional. It's twice as hard to leave the cell, and twice as hard, or more than twice. It depends on how much it's thickening uh, to enter the cell. Um, so as we said, normal content, bigger size, meaning that the molecule is moving slower. It's going to have passage problems because it's bigger. It's going to create bigger drag, um, easier to collide with other substances. So that's not a good thing to start with. Um, let's see. You can see that the causes are either genetic, so ineffective DNA synthesis, meaning that you're not uh, um, expressing the genes correctly to produce the cells correctly. You can see that it might be a deficiency with a component needed to produce normal red blood cells, in this case B12, or folate deficiency, which is obviously, for example, very important when someone is pregnant, right? So we want them to have take those supplements to make sure that mother and baby or babies are fine. Then these cells tend to die faster than others, decreasing their numbers, which leads by definition to anemia, right? Um, so the whole creation of cells to start with, from start to end, is unusual under these conditions. And you can see that cell division is either blocked or delayed. Either way, um, we have a problem. Um, then you can see that we have, with time, an enlargement or an increase of the content of hemoglobin in the cells that will make this cell also hyperreactive. And this is part of what makes it bigger and in size. And just remember that hemoglobin includes iron. In the middle, iron has a +3 um, level, right? So that's definitely going to make it reactive. Okay, uh, you can see that every division cycle of the cell increases the difference between DNA and RNA synthesis, and this is a major problem. Okay, let's talk about PA. You see that PA is caused by B12 deficiency, um, which is usually accommodated with inflammation of the gastric area of the body. Uh, you can see that it's indicated that this is a unique combination. The lack of IF decreases or prevents the absorption of B12. So this is a mediator, um, and it's essential to the production of red blood cells. So um, you can see that it can be congenital or acquired, and it will lead to secondary deficiencies such as hydrochloric chloric acid, pepsin, and IF secretion. So there's multiple problems. Of course, there's an autoimmune. There can be an autoimmune background that causes the immune system to attack the body. Uh, what else? Then complications may include cancer, but that's always true. And it can progress slowly if it's untreated over decades. So the problem with that is that when it's over decades, it progresses slow. That's the good news. But the bad news is that that usually makes people asymptomatic until it's either too late or severe. So that's why frequent visits to the physician are important. You can see that early symptoms are usually non-specific and vague, meaning it's harder to diagnose. Um, and then you see that the classic symptoms of anemia become apparent when hemoglobin decreases to 7 or 8 grams per deciliter, which is definitely lower than it should be. Once again, look at the symptoms. Everything that has to do with oxygen is in there. Weakness, fatigue, right? Especially at the end parts of your body. Appetite loss, abdominal pain, weight loss, sore tongue. A lot of You have multiple tissues that are reacting, sending you signs that they are low on oxygen. Folate deficiency. So, as already indicated, folic acid is essential for DNA and RNA synthesis. So, you're tapping You're influencing the genetic aspects of the normal function of the cell and making it abnormal. Uh, you can intake folic acid through diet, which is a good thing. Um, then it's supposed to be normally stored in the liver. Um, and you can see that the wrong diet can also cause the malnutrition or the lack of folate when we talk about malnutrition of vegetables or alcoholism, which interferes with its absorption. So you see that the symptoms are basically the same as PA without the neurological aspects. Um, Unique symptoms: you have the scales of the mouth, you have mouth inflammation. Uh, you see that the vast majority of the symptoms are focused in the mouth area. So remember that it will be easier to identify the anemia that way. So if the vast majority of problems are in the mouth, folate deficiency. Um, Now we can go and check the other side of the spectrum. Instead of enlarged red blood cells, we can talk about smaller red blood cells. With this, in this case, you can see that it's hypochromic, meaning that you have less than enough hemoglobin in them, and that is a problem to start with, right? So when you look at the major components of hemoglobin, you have 4 hem units, and in the middle you have the iron or the furin that acts as the main connector or attacher to oxygen and CO2. So any one any deficiency in those 2 main components are probably going to cause the red blood cell to be inactive or smaller. Okay, so you see that it's the result of iron metabolism, uh, porphyrin, globin, and hem synthesis disorders, meaning they are not combined together as they should or not created in the right amount. Then you can see with IDA, um, once again, very simple idea. You take hemoglobin, in the middle you have iron, which is highly reactive, right? And you take it out or there's not enough. So now you don't have the main component, the hand, so to speak, that grabs oxygen and connects it to hemoglobin. So now hemoglobin is not being carried as it should um, in the blood, and you have hypoxia. So of course, this is going to affect every tissue that is not able to become more efficient. And you can see this, that there's multiple reasons why you can be low on iron. I think they're pretty easy to understand on your own. What else? The symptoms are pretty simple. They get worse as the hypoxia gets worse. Hopefully, you don't get to a place where you're at anoxia, because then you're dead. Um, then, if you lack iron, then you might lack iron also in enzymes that need it to function. Uh, Once you tap into enzymes, you're in a very bad place. So obviously, this is a very bad deficiency to have. Then you have the recommended daily amounts. You might These amounts might change from table to table and source to source, but this is the one that I thought was the most accurate, in my opinion, only. Okay, then we have SA, which is basically a group of disorders uh, that are due to insufficient iron uptake, uh, leading to insufficient or abnormal hemoglobin synthesis production. Uh, the hallmark, and you want to remember this, is that the bone marrow cells are shaped as rings. Okay, that's very unusual. Um, and then you see that the iron granules are arranged around the nucleus. So that definitely is something you want to remember and associate with SAs. Um, it can be acquired, which is idiopathic in this case. It can be inherited. Um, and then you see that we have reversible SA, which is another form, which is usually secondary to alcoholism or drugs or some kind of substance abuse, which could be counteracted. And then if it's caught early enough, it can be reversible. Um, you can see that diabetes is a contributor to it. How surprising. And you see that most SAs are due to temporary influences uh, rather than chronic influences. Um, okay, now we can talk about NNAs. Um, in NNAs, you see that the size is normal, hemoglobin is normal, but their number is low. So, no problem with the shape itself, no problem with the size itself, no problem with the content itself, but you don't have enough copies of the cell. Okay, so uh, in slide 71, that we can see that overproduction or deficiency of the cells that results in hematologic dysfunction, right? So if you have excessive marrow elements, uh, you might have an imbalance of hormonal signals, either internal to the cell or external to the cell. Uh, if you talk about polycythemia, you talk about excessive production of RBCs, and that can be relative or absolute. Absolute, sorry. Uh, the relative form is uh, means that you don't have an actual change in the amount of cells, but their concentration goes up or down according to the volume of the solution. Okay, in the um, absolute form, you have a loss or production of actual cells, and that is what's changing the concentration. Then we can talk about PV. It's the primary form of absolute polycythemia. You can see that it's a chronic and clonal alteration due to overproduction of RBCs with a unique combination of increased white blood cells, platelets, and splenomegaly. Uh, everything is overproduced. This is very unique, okay? Very simple to understand and remember. In PV, everything is overproduced, every cell. Uh, obviously, this is due to over or hyperactivity of bone marrow. Um, for many reasons. It can be chemical, it can be hormonal, and it can be the increase in size as well. Then you also have a genetic form, both of which are rare. So in this case, you have neoplasm. You have to start remembering the terms, right? And we're integrating them as I promised you, but it's non cancerous. Uh, and in this case, the stem cells proliferation is increased, um, and you also have self destruction, uh, expansion of RBCs. So you can notice that erythropoietin levels might still be normal. Uh, they might be slightly decreased, but it's still idiopathic, right? We suspect, like with a lot of idiopathic causes, usually the first assumption is that there is a genetic background uh, to the problem. Um, let's see. So, of course, you have a change in the viscosity of the blood tissue. It becomes more thick and sticky, which is going to affect every tissue possible, and it's going to slow down blood, meaning it's going to decrease stroke volume and increase heart rate, and that's something that we can notice. um, you can see that we have the Renault phenomenon, and we're talking about excessively reduced blood flow in response to cold or emotional stress uh, as part of what can occur. You see that we have angina, we have decreased and inflamed blood vessels. You see cardiovascular infraction background. So obviously, you change the viscosity of the blood tissue, you change flow. It's going to affect tissues one after the other. And then you can see a very interesting neurological hallmark and unique symptom, as unique as it gets, as the kid can tells you. The need to itch, very painful and intense itching uh, that intensifies by heat or water. So, if you're heating, if it's a hot environment, if you're heating up the room, or you're taking a shower that is also with hot water, it's gonna become very, very crazy. Um, okay, let's stop here and we'll continue in the next video.